In the early spring of 1922, a profound and unnatural silence fell over a remote patch of the Bavarian countryside. About 70 kilometers north of Munich, hidden behind a dense screen of timber, sat a farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It wasn't a village or even a hamlet. Its name literally translated to behind Kaifeck, a nod to its physical and social isolation. On this farm lived the Gruber family, the elderly patriarch Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Josef. To the people of the nearby village of Weidhofen, the Grubers were a source of dark rumors and avoided glances. Andreas was a stern, unfriendly man with a reputation for being tight-fisted and cruel. Years earlier, he and Victoria had been convicted of incest, a scandal that had permanently stained the family's name and driven them further into the shadows of their own land. But as March 1922 drew to a close, the family began to experience something far more terrifying than the judgment of their neighbors. It started with the ghosts. 6 months earlier, the family's previous maid had quit in a state of absolute terror. She claimed that the house was haunted, that she could hear footsteps in the attic when no one was there, and that she felt a constant, malevolent presence watching her from the dark corners of the barn. Andreas, a hard-headed man of the earth, had dismissed her fears as womanly superstition, but by mid-March, even he could no longer ignore the physical reality of what was happening. One morning, Andreas discovered a Munich newspaper on the property. It was a publication no one in the area subscribed to, and the postman denied losing it. Days later, after a light dusting of snow, Andreas found a set of footprints leading from the edge of the forest directly toward the farm's machine room. He followed them with a lantern, his breath hitching in the cold air. The tracks were clear and deep, leading straight to the house, but as he circled the perimeter, his blood ran cold. There were no return tracks. Someone had walked out of the woods and into the farmstead, but they had never walked back out. That night, the family heard the footsteps again, heavy, rhythmic thudding coming from the floorboards directly above their heads. Andreas searched the attic with a gun and a lamp, but he found the space empty. Soon after, a set of house keys went missing. A tool was found out of place. The lock on the machine room was discovered broken. Despite these omens, Andreas refused to call the police or accept help from his neighbors. He was a man who kept his own secrets, and he intended to face the intruder on his own terms. He had no way of knowing that the intruder was already living among them, watching them through the cracks in the ceiling, waiting for the perfect moment to descend. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. She had been escorted there by her sister, who was the last person to see the family alive. Maria had only been in the house for a few hours when the sun began to set over the Bavarian timber. What happened next was a methodical execution of terrifying precision. Investigators believe the killer took up a position in the barn, perhaps using the sounds of restless livestock to lure the family out one by one. Andreas was likely the first to investigate. As he stepped into the shadows of the stable, he was met with the crushing force of a mattock, a heavy pickaxe-like tool. The blow was expert, aimed at the head, killing him almost instantly. Next came his wife, Cecilia. She was struck 7 times, her skull cracked by the blunt force of the tool. Then came Victoria, choir singer who had spent her life under her father's thumb. She was struck 9 times, so her face and head left unrecognizable by what the autopsy later described as star-shaped wounds. The most horrifying discovery, however, was 7-year-old Cecilia. She had been lured into the barn after her mother, but unlike the adults, she didn't die immediately. Forensic analysis later revealed that the little girl lay in the hay for several hours, surrounded by the bodies of her family, trapped in a state of profound shock and agony. In her final moments of terror, she had torn out clumps of her own hair with her bare hands. Once the barn was silent, the killer moved toward the house. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived only hours earlier, was killed in her bedchamber before she could even unpack her things. Finally, the killer entered Victoria's room and approached the crib of 2-year-old Joseph. With a single heavy blow to the face, the family line was extinguished. But the horror of Hinterkaifeck doesn't end with the murders. It begins with what happened in the 4 days that followed. Over the next few days, the people of Weidhofen noticed that smoke continued to rise from the Hinterkaifeck chimney. On the night of April 1st, a farmer passing by saw 2 mysterious figures at the edge of the woods who turned away to hide their faces. The next night, an artisan named Michael Plöckel passed the farm and saw the oven being heated. A man with a lantern approached him, blinding him with the light before retreating back into the house. Plöckel noted a revolting smell coming from the chimney, a scent that suggested something other than wood was being burned in the hearth. For 4 days, the killer lived in the house with the 6 corpses. They used the kitchen to cook meals, eating through the family's supply of bread and meat. They slept in the beds. They lit fires to keep warm in the spring chill. Most disturbingly, they continued the farm's daily routine. The cattle were fed and watered. The family dog, a Pomeranian, was cared for. The killer wasn't hiding. They were occupying the lives they had just ended. By Tuesday, April 4th, the community could no longer ignore the silence. Young Cecilia had missed school for days, and the family had been absent from Sunday church. A local mechanic, Albert Hoffner, arrived at the farm to repair an engine. He worked for 4.5 hours, seeing no one but hearing the dog bark and feeling a heavy, oppressive sense that someone was watching him from inside the house. Later that afternoon, a search party led by a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer finally entered the property. They broke into the barn and found the first 4 bodies stacked atop one another, hidden under a thin layer of hay. In the house, they found Maria and little Joseph. The discovery was met with immediate suspicion toward Schlittenbauer himself. He was the man who had been in a relationship with Victoria, or the man who had claimed paternity of young Joseph before retracting it to avoid child support. When the search party arrived, the doors to the house were locked, yet Schlittenbauer allegedly produced a key and entered the house alone, claiming he was looking for his son. The police investigation that followed was a disaster of the modern era. Before the inspectors from Munich could arrive, dozens of curious locals had swarmed the farm, walking through the blood, touching the murder weapon, and even sitting in the kitchen to eat the remaining food. The crime scene was effectively erased. In their desperation, the Munich police took the victims' heads and sent them to clairvoyance, hoping for a psychic lead. The heads were never returned and were eventually lost during the chaos of World War II. The victims of Hinterkaifeck were buried in a headless grave, their skulls separated from their bodies just as the truth had been separated from the case. The farm was demolished in 1923, an attempt to wipe the stain of the murders from the earth. As the workers tore down the attic floorboards, they found the murder weapon, the family's own mattock, still caked in dried blood and hair. It had been hidden in the very spot where the killer had sat for days, listening to the Grubers live their final hours. Decades passed. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, from wandering vagrants to Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had supposedly died in the trenches of the Great War, but was rumored to have returned for a bloody revenge. None of the leads held. In 2007, students at a German police academy used modern profiling to review the case files. They reached a unanimous conclusion on who the killer was, but they refused to release the name out of respect for the suspect's living descendants. Today, the site of Hinterkaifeck is nothing but an empty field. There is no house, no barn, no machine room. Only a small shrine stands nearby, a quiet reminder of the 6 people who were slaughtered there. But the mystery of that spring in 1922 remains as cold as the Bavarian snow. We are left with the image of the footprints, the tracks that lead from the dark woods, through the gate and into the house, the tracks that never led back out. The killer came from the forest, took a family's lives, lived in their home, and then simply vanished into the mist of history, leaving behind only the silence of the dead and the unanswered question, who was the stranger in the attic?